2 weeks ago, we started a new series. It's talking about how to deal with our emotions, but in a way that's healthy. There's two unhealthy ways that we talked about. Okay, one of the ways is to stuff your emotions. You don't address it, you ignore it altogether. I'm going to show you, I'm reading a book called The New Myth of Normal, and it talks about the negativity of that, okay? This is just one of the examples, but he says, in man, the immune system's capacity to react to prostate cancer was diminished in those with a tendency to suppress anger. So what is he saying? The more you suppress anger, your body is going to react to that. Your body is going to become weakened because it cannot handle the suppressed anger that you have. So therefore, the likelihood of you getting prostate cancer, it's going to what? It's going to actually rise. Okay? And so what we normally do is we have two extreme views. We say suppress anger altogether. But at the same time, we live in a society where we are reacting from that. And so we say, no, your feelings are everything. Your feelings are your true self. That is your authentic self. And in this book, it actually talks about that. Okay? It says, to be authentic is to be the true to a self, of self arising from one's own unique or genuine essence. Okay? In essence, what it's saying is, who you are is what you feel. What you feel is who you are. So therefore, again, I gave this example 2 weeks ago, but if you don't feel something for your significant other anymore, what should you do? You should leave them. You should divorce them. Why? Because you don't feel it anymore. Okay? But again, we talked about how this is very, very dangerous as well. Imagine eating whenever you felt like eating. How many of you guys would be 50 pounds heavier? 100 pounds heavier right here, okay? Okay, imagine you only were good to your kids or your wife or your husband, your co-workers, whenever you felt like helping them. How many of you guys would still be in that relationship? None of you, okay? So this is going way overboard, okay? So we have two extreme views. And so we have a very difficult time when it comes to emotions and feelings. Because either we suppress them, we don't deal with emotions very well, or we become so immersed in it that we drown in it. Okay? And we said there's a third way. The Bible actually teaches a third way. In the Psalms, it tells us not just to stuff it, not just to drown in it, but to actually pray about them. Okay? But not just vent it out to God, pray just to God, but actually process these emotions with God. Okay? So there's a third way. Praying your emotions. That's what we've been going over. Today we're going to talk about a feeling that all of us are very, very aware of, something that we really, really struggle with. And I realized through yesterday's discussion that people really have a difficult time dealing with this emotion, okay? Which is guilt. Today we're going to see David learning or actually teaching us how to actually pray our guilt. Not to stuff it down, not to distract it, not to drown in it, but to actually deal with it properly. We're going to go to Psalms 32. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven. Siri actually found Psalms 32 for me. Okay. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. That's guilt. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. We'll come back to this. Then I acknowledged my sin to you. So there's a confession, repentance. And did not cover up my iniquities. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. And you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely, the rising of the mighty waters, which is guilt, will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with song of deliverance. This is the word of God. Okay? So we're going to talk about a couple of things. First, we're going to talk about the power of guilt. And David really, really perfectly illustrates what guilt does to us. It's very poetic, but it describes that guilt, the power of guilt, really, really well. And I don't need to describe it too much because you guys have already gone through guilt and you guys can resonate with this concept of guilt. First one, there's a physical, he's saying my bones are wasting away. So he's basically saying there's physical like pain that comes with this mental pain of guilt. So not only are you mentally messed up, it actually makes you feel weak. It makes you feel like your strength is gone. Next one right here. It says, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. Right? It's this constant, like we talked about this yesterday in our group, but it's this idea of like God has his hand upon you. And even though you want to like distract yourself from the guilt, you don't want to think about it, you're constantly reminded of it. It's there always. Right? If somebody's hands were upon you, you're constantly thinking about that person's hands upon your shoulder. So it's like that. Guilt is this relentless thing that just keeps coming back and back and back and back. And so what's the result of that? The result of it is, look, my strength was sapped. So you just become depressed. You become really lethargic. You become really, really weak because you get tired of it. It's going on and on and on and on, and it doesn't stop. It just gets worse. And it doesn't give you energy, it actually saps your energy away. Okay, so all of us have experienced this idea of guilt before, this emotion. And we don't like it. Okay, let me give you in literature, okay, a couple of other examples of how we experience guilt and how we kind of try to do away with it. First example is from a movie called 7 Pound. It's with Will Smith. It was quite a bit ago. But the basic idea, his name is Ben, and he's trying to basically atone for his sin, okay, throughout the whole movie. And the way he atones for his sin is that he will give up his life, he will commit suicide, and then he will give his organs to other people who need it. Why? Because he has taken away life, and so he feels like he has to atone for it. He has so much guilt himself. So he says, the only way I can escape from my guilt is because I took life away, I'm going to give life to other people who need it. That's how I'm going to resolve with guilt. Now, some of you guys will say, well, that's an extreme example. Okay? That's a big sin. What happened was he was actually looking on his phone while he was driving. Okay? And then his wife and unborn child, and there was a car crash, and everybody died except him. Okay? So you go, that's an extreme example. Okay, that's why he has to do something extreme. Okay? Well, there's another example. There's a guy named Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. He's pretty well known in like the literature area. I don't know if you guys are into that. Anyways, there was a time, he talks about a time when he was younger, his dad used to own a fruit stand. Okay, a long time ago. You remember they didn't have like stores, everything was outside in the marketplace. And his dad told him, hey, please, son, I have to go somewhere. I want you to stay here and watch out for the fruit stand. But he didn't. Okay, he was a little kid. He didn't. It was too hard for him. So he left. But that guilt of not listening to his dad stayed with him for such a long, long time in his life. So what happens? What happens is that when he grew up, after even his dad died, he goes back to that same exact spot that the fruit stand was at, and he stood there for 2 hours in the rain. Why? Again, because of guilt. Because he wanted to eliminate this feeling of guilt. But how about this case? Okay? He's a small child. It's a small sin. And yet his guilt stayed with him throughout his life, so much so that he felt like the only way to atone his sin or to get rid of his guilt is by standing in the rain. Now, some of you guys say, well, he's just wrong. Okay? What are you guys talking about? This sense of guilt, don't you understand? This is just a man-made concept. Or maybe some of you guys don't believe in God. And so you go, I can decide for myself what good and bad is. So I don't need to feel guilty about the sins in the Bible. I can just create my own sense of rule. And so I don't have to feel guilty. Guilt is something that was given unto me as society. Well, there's another literature that goes against it. Crime and Punishment is a book, and there's a book in there, and his main character is Raskolnikov, And basically, Raskolnikov is that. He's that modern relativist. He basically says, there is no God. I'm going to create my own morality. And as long as I think what I'm doing is right, that's all that matters. And he actually tests out his theory. He decides to kill his landlord in the book. Why? Because she's a terrible lady. Okay, she's a terrible, terrible lady. She's no good for society. Everybody who lives there is miserable because of her. And so for him, he has every reason to kill her. But what happens? Throughout the movie, throughout the book, he can't escape guilt. So that's interesting, because on the one hand, he said, I can create my own concept of morality. I can say whatever is right, whatever is wrong. But I still can't escape the sense of guilt. And this is why a lot of people, even though they don't necessarily believe in God, they live with this sense of guilt. They can't escape it, even though they want to. Raskolnikov, he can't. So do you know what he does at the end? Even though he escaped the police, he killed her perfectly, so much so that there was no evidence to convict him. He is so convicted of his guilt that he actually gives himself over to the police at the end. And do you know what it says? It says, he felt as though, when he confessed, he felt as though he had never lived before. He found so much relief and so much peace in his life that he felt like he wasn't living before. And that's how much the power of guilt is. Whether you believe in God or not, whether you want to justify things, in the end, every single human being has to deal with guilt. There's many different ways to deal with guilt. And I gave you guys some examples of this, but I'm going to give you guys 7 different ways that we deal with guilt. I want you guys to kind of try to do an inventory list and see how many of these things that you guys see doing. Number 1, we blame shift. Okay? My mom's fault, my dad's fault, it's the way I grew up, it's my environment's fault, it's my coworker's fault. Okay? It's that church member's fault. Okay? It's someone else's fault. Okay? That's why I'm feeling the way I do. It's my wife's fault. Next, redefine. So this is what Raskolnikov did. He said, I will define what is right or what is wrong. I will define it myself. Okay? But again, you still feel guilt. But you redefine it to make yourself feel better. Well, is that really sin? Okay. Next one is something that we probably do a lot, which is medicate or numb it. Okay? So some of us, this is through shopping. Some of us, it's through alcohol. Some of us, it's through narcotics and different things. Okay? Some of us, it's through different addiction. We numb it. Some of us, it's even through eating. Okay? We try to numb this guilt away. Medicate it as much as possible. Next, we criticize and gossip. The basic idea is we look down upon other people. Why? Because even though I feel guilty, when I look down on other people, that makes me feel better. What do you think we like reading the news? What do you think we like, what's that, TMZ, right? About celebrities and reading about those kind of gossip. Why? Because they look worse than us. We feel good. It makes us feel good. My life is not good, but that person's life, woo, so much worse than mine. So it's easier to criticize and to gossip and to look down upon others. Makes me feel better. Next, overachieve. Some of us, we think it's kind of like this concept, right? It's like I messed up, but if I overachieve, then maybe I can atone for my sin. Next concept is very similar, but give generously. Okay? It's this concept of, again, it's that 7-pound example, the Will Smith example. I have taken away something, so I'm going to give as much as possible. Then, again, I feel like I've equalized. I have paid for my sin. Last one is penitence. Okay, it's this concept of, I will suffer. Okay, fine. I will pay for this. Kind of like the young boy, Samuel Johnson. Okay? I will stand out in the rain, in the cold for 2 hours, because I deserve that. So I will fully take on all my sin. And some of you guys, so, are in so much guilt that you're like, I can't be happy. Why? Because I deserve this unhappiness. This is my fault. So therefore, I need to take the full blunt of it. Okay? These are 7 different ways. In which ways do you see yourself dealing with guilt. There's some people who actually say majority of the way we behave actually all goes back to guilt. It's really interesting. If you think about all the negative things that we do, which is all of this, it actually can all go back to guilt. Okay? So again, guilt, the power of guilt is really, really, really strong. And a lot of us, including myself, we have a really difficult time dealing with it. Again, do you guys see why David says, oh man, I feel like I'm in this hot weather and I'm just like walking through the desert and I have no energy. Do you see why he says, God's hand is heavy upon me? And night and day, it was so long. Again, some of you guys really, really understand this. Some of you guys, right now, you feel exactly like this. And you see yourself, again, trying to, again, either deal with this guilt in all these negative ways. Okay? But David gives us a solution. Okay? You don't have to do any of these things. Because all of these things will harm you even more. David actually gives us a response. Okay? He says, then I acknowledge my sin to you. What is that? That is confession. Okay, that is confession. And then I did not cover up my iniquity. This part is really, really important. Okay? Let me give you a definition of confession or repentance for you guys. Okay? It is to uncover 100%. It is to uncover 100%. And then if you look at verse 1, it says, blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. That's when healing comes. Okay? So I know most of us, we don't like the word confession or we don't like the word repentance. But if you do it, there's a blessing. Okay, there's a way out of guilt, which is you uncover first. And then after that, you will be covered. Okay, let's go over this concept together. Again, many of us, we don't go here. Okay? It's really difficult. It takes us a long time to even acknowledge our sin. Why? Because acknowledging, you have to basically say, I messed up. Acknowledging says, I don't know what I'm doing. Acknowledging says, I've made a mistake. And many of us don't like doing that because of our pride. We don't like to say, I made a mistake. So that's step number one. But we have a hard time. So instead, it's easier to redefine. It's easier to not to think about it altogether. It's easier to just to escape. Yeah? All of the 7 things that we talked about. But I think the second thing is something that I think a lot of us really, really fail to do. Okay, including myself, which is, I did not cover up my iniquities. A lot of times what we do is, God, I know I messed up, but if that person didn't do this, then I would have been okay. Okay? So when we come in front of God, we know that we messed up. So it's kind of like we uncover a little bit of our fault, but we don't fully uncover it altogether. We kind of just said, God, I'll just show you a little bit of what I did wrong. But the rest of it, it's their fault. The rest of it, it's because of the scenario. So rest of it is because something else happened. So what do? We justify it. We downplay our sin or our guilt. So we don't fully expose ourselves to God. Why? Again, because we're fearful. We're scared. We don't want to be rejected. We don't want to be vulnerable. Genesis 3 perfectly describes this. I know I talk about Genesis 3 a lot, but it really shows us why we have this sense of guilt, why we have such a hard time opening up. If you guys remember in Genesis chapter 3, actually in chapter 2, it tells us that Adam and Eve, they were butt naked. But they had no guilt, they had no shame. But when sin came in Genesis 3, what happens? What happens? They were totally naked, they were fine with it, they were jumping around, and yet they go into hiding mode. And what do? The first thing they do is they try to cover up themselves. And so this is our natural tendency as human beings. We become really, really ashamed. We don't want to drown in guilt. So what do? We kind of confess, And yet, we try to cover parts of ourselves as well. So we're basically saying, God, forgive me, and yet we're covering ourselves. And we're saying, well, I had every reason to do that to him or that person. Okay, well, if I didn't grow up this way, if my parents didn't treat me that way, or if my kids didn't do this, again, David teaches us, if you want full healing, then you need to fully uncover. Not make a bunch of excuses, okay, but take responsibility for your action. Again, does that mean that your parents, how you grew up, or your kid, all of those? Absolutely. Those things could be the reason why. Okay? But again, when you come in front of God, no excuses. You tell it how it is. Okay? You don't talk about other people. You talk about yourself. No trying to cover it up. But you stand in front of God. And you say, this is what I did. This is very, very important. Because if we do not do this, we're never going to get to the second part. Okay? We need to do the first part really, really well. But again, I think a lot of us, although you might say, I'm confessing, but I still don't feel this healing, it's because I think a lot of times we get stuck right here, which is we're kind of like uncovering, but we don't fully uncover. And so because of that, we're not fully healed. I could tell, for example, my wife, my sins, right? My mistakes. But I can make it very general. I can say, you know, honey, in the past, there were some girls, but you know, you forgive me, right? Okay, that's very general. But let's say I share with her all the mistakes I made. I make it more specific. I tell her the acts of what I did. And then she forgives me, what happens? I don't have to think about what ifs. What if this? Well, I didn't share this with God. So what if I really share this, God doesn't forgive me? So when you fully uncover, no excuses, then you can find full healing as well. Does that make sense? Full acceptance as well. A lot of times, again, we're not doing this, and so therefore we're not finding full healing. Second part. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. This is really, really the beauty of Christianity. This is like, if you do confession correctly, it hurts so much, and yet there is full healing. Okay, why is that? Because we see that even in Genesis 3, we see that God doesn't yell at them. He doesn't scream at them. He doesn't shame them. What does he do instead? He actually, if you read towards the end of chapter 3, it says, he actually makes clothes for them. Okay, and he clothed them instead. Do you understand what that means? What that means is, it's not like a deer just like came jumping over and says, "Whoo, have my skin," and then left. That means that there was a sacrifice. That it's pointing to Jesus. It's pointing to Jesus because we know that Jesus was stripped. We know that he was fully naked when he was dying. Why? Why is Jesus doing that? Why is Jesus dying of guilt and shame? Why is he dying there on the cross like that? Well, it tells us. It tells us that Jesus is stripped away and he dies for our sin. He dies for our guilt and shame. Why? So that each and every one of us can take on Jesus' clothes. We can be dressed. And so we can be forgiven as well. This is really important because many of you guys in here do not, including myself, we do not like this concept at all. Again, we rather stand in the rain for 2 hours. We rather destroy ourselves and die and then give so that we can atone for ourselves. We rather do it ourselves. Because again, the guilt is so strong that we feel like it's not worthy just for forgiveness. And you guys are absolutely correct. None of us are worthy of Jesus' forgiveness, God's forgiveness. But because of what God has done, because of what Jesus has done. Do you understand? It took Jesus' sacrifice to forgive us. So it's not this cheap thing where God goes, Forgiveness for you, forgiveness for you, forgiveness for you, throw it out. No, it was never a cheap thing. It cost the life of his own son. And that's what it takes. Again, if you look within yourself, there is nothing that you have done to receive forgiveness. And if you're going to wait until that day, trust me, your guilt is going to be way too much and you're going to drown in it. Instead, what Psalms is teaching us is fully confess to God, no excuses. But understand that Jesus is the one who covers you. Not because of what you have done, not because you leveled it up by giving generously or coming to church or reading the Bible more. No, none of these things. It's only through what Jesus has done on the cross that we can be covered. Blessed is the one, and I know we don't use this word bless, but the easiest way to understand it is happy. Happy is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Happy is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. This happiness is available for every single one of us in this room. Every single one of us. No more guilt. No more God's heavy hands. No more sapped, walking around in the desert, in the dark, in the sun. None of that anymore. You can escape guilt. You can deal with guilt. How? By coming to God in prayer, confessing to Him and saying, these are all the different things I have done wrong. And I deserve all the punishment. I deserve all the pain that I'm receiving right now. But Jesus has taken all of those things away. And through that, you cover me. So I can be happy. I can have peace with God. I can stand boldly in front of God because of what Jesus has done. Hold on to that, Jesus. Every single one of us, this blessing is offered to us. Will you take it today? Will you take it this week? We're going to go into time of reflection. It's very short, but hopefully this can be a time where you can confess to God and that you can find healing.